On 16 November 2009, in the underground halls of the Natanz fuel enrichment plant, a control room technician set a small glass of tea beside his keyboard and nudged it away from the edge with 2 fingers. Fluorescent light hums on painted concrete, fans push dry, filtered air across racks of IR1 centrifuge controls. On the monitors, Siemens Step 7 software shows green bars, steady RPM, no alarms. The room sounds like a routine. Months later, a report from the Institute for Science and International Security will quietly note that between late 2009 and early 2010, approximately 1,000 centrifuges were suddenly removed from service at Natanz, likely due to a new piece of malicious code analysts will name Stuxnet. In Fort Meade and a secure compound near Tel Aviv, coders from the United States and Israel will call the wider operation Olympic Games, a covert campaign meant to make machines fail while screens insist everything is normal. In this room, on this shift, a man straightens his cup and trusts the numbers. He will not know until much later that the real damage began on a day that looked exactly like this one. The narration opens in Washington, D.C. in late 2006 as President George W. meets national security aides in the Situation Room. The meeting takes place in November, shortly after midterm elections that have shifted congressional power and complicated the administration's foreign policy options. Iran's enrichment at Natanz is ramping up. Diplomacy is stalled. Israeli leaders warn about unilateral strikes that could ignite a regional war. Internal memos and later reporting by New York Times journalist David E. Sanger describe how Bush authorizes a covert cyber-sabotage program against Natanz, codenamed Olympic Games, developed jointly with Israel. The decision is presented not as an act of war, but as an alternative to one, a way to slow Iran's progress without cruise missiles or ground troops. The Situation Room is windowless, lit by recessed lighting that casts no shadows. Around the table sit representatives from the CIA, NSA, Pentagon, and State Department. The discussion is technical in parts: what capabilities exist, what vulnerabilities have been identified in Iranian systems, and strategic in others. National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley summarizes the options. Accept Iran's enrichment capacity as a fait accompli. Pursue more aggressive sanctions that may not work. Support an Israeli military strike with all its regional consequences, or attempt something unprecedented, using cyber capabilities to physically sabotage the program without visible intrusion. A context bridge notes that Natanz had been under IAEA monitoring since the early 2000s, with cameras recording cascades of IR1 centrifuges spinning underground in reinforced halls carved from desert rock. Safeguards agreements did not prevent enrichment itself, only diversion of nuclear material into weapons. Iran was operating within the technical boundaries of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, even as it accumulated low-enriched uranium at a pace that alarmed Western capitals. The IAEA reported regularly on the number of centrifuges installed, the amount of uranium being processed, and Iran's cooperation, or lack thereof, with inspection requests. We move from the Situation Room to a simple wooden desk at Fort Meade in early 2007, where an NSA planner nudges a coffee cup away from a stack of printed PLC manuals. The desk is in a secure compartmented information facility, accessed through multiple checkpoints and cipher locks. The manuals are dense, technical, filled with ladder logic and frequency parameters for industrial control systems, specifically Siemens controllers used in manufacturing and infrastructure worldwide. In a draft concept paper, one line captures the program's ambition: disrupt the physical process without visible intrusion. The idea is elegant and dangerous. Write code that can make steel rotors tear themselves apart while operators see only normal readings, a digital deception layered over mechanical reality. The planner, whose name remains classified, but whose role has been described in subsequent reporting, has a background in both computer science and industrial engineering. Understanding how to attack Natanz requires understanding both the software that controls the centrifuges and the physics of how centrifuges fail. The concept paper outlines a multi-stage approach: infiltrate the control networks, identify specific targets, execute commands that cause physical damage, and cover the attack by manipulating sensor data. Archival anchors here include NSC deliberations, later recounted in Sanger's book, Confront and Conceal. IAEA, Iran's safeguards reports that documented the expanding Cascade installations with precise counts and configurations, and technical profiles of Natanz published by the Nuclear Threat Initiative and the Institute for Science and International Security. These sources confirmed the timeline, the participants, and the scale of what was being contemplated. They also revealed the careful deliberation. This was not a rogue operation, but a presidential decision with cabinet-level support. The narrator notes that the first decision in the Olympic Games is not about code, but about boundaries. How far a democratic state is willing to go when the weapon leaves no crater, no visible scar, no smoking gun that would allow Iran to rally international support. The legal justification would be debated internally. Was this self-defense, anticipatory action against a nuclear threat, or something new that existing frameworks didn't adequately address? The next step is to find where, inside a sealed hall in Natanz, software can do what bombs cannot, achieve a physical effect that appears to the untrained eye like nothing more than industrial misfortune. By spring 2007, in a secure facility in the Negev desert and in compartments at Fort Meade, American and Israeli teams began sharing data. Open sources describe NSA's Tailored Access Operations, U.S. Cyber Command, and Israeli Signals Intelligence Unit 8200, working under a Mossad-led framework to design a worm specifically for the IR-1 centrifuge cascade at Natanz. The collaboration is compartmented, restricted to personnel with special clearances beyond top secret, briefed on what they need to know and nothing more. Even within the intelligence communities of both nations, knowledge of the Olympic Games is limited to a small circle. On one Thursday in June 2007, a young Israeli developer in the joint lab turns away from his screen long enough to water a small potted plant on his workstation, then returns to a block of Siemens S7315 PLC code. The plant is a desert succulent, chosen because it needs little attention, a quiet piece of normalcy in a room where everything else is about disruption. The developer has been working on this project for 3 months, writing and rewriting code that must be both destructive and invisible. Across the room, an American engineer reviews an IAEA technical annex on the configuration of Natanz's fuel enrichment plant, not for secret drawings, but for frequencies, cascade layouts, and maintenance cycles. The IAEA's own transparency mechanisms, meant to reassure the world, have inadvertently become intelligence gold for those seeking to exploit the facility's vulnerabilities. The technical challenge is substantial. The worm must navigate multiple layers, Windows operating systems running on operator workstations, Siemens Step 7 engineering software used to program PLCs, the PLCs themselves controlling frequency converters, and finally the converters that regulate the speed of centrifuge motors. Each layer has its own security measures, its own potential failure points. The code must be modular, different components handling different tasks, and robust enough to work even if parts of the attack chain are disrupted. One slide in a briefing, preserved later in internal histories summarized by think tank studies, distills the operational requirement: delay and degrade, do not destroy. The aim, as Sanger later reports, is to add time on the clock, not to trigger overt war. The distinction matters. Destroyed centrifuges can be replaced, a program set back by months or years without Iran knowing exactly why or how, creates strategic advantage without diplomatic catastrophe. If Iran discovers the attack too quickly, if the damage is too obvious, they might respond with military action against Israel or U.S. interests. If the attack is too subtle, it achieves nothing. Finding the right calibration requires extensive modeling. The teams work through summer into fall, the collaboration growing more sophisticated as trust builds. Intelligence sharing becomes more detailed. The Israelis contribute human intelligence about Natanz's operations and maintenance schedules. The Americans provide signals intelligence and technical expertise on Windows vulnerabilities and rootkit design. Both sides bring expertise in industrial control systems, though the Israelis have more specific knowledge of Iranian procurement patterns and the likely configuration at Natanz. Code is written, tested in sandbox environments, rewritten when simulations reveal flaws. The worm must be sophisticated enough to navigate Windows networks, recognize Siemens industrial control software, identify specific PLC configurations, and execute destructive commands, all while remaining undetected by antivirus software and human operators. It must spread, but not spread too far. It must activate only in the right environment. It must cover its tracks by manipulating the very sensors that would detect its presence. The development is iterative. Early versions are too aggressive, causing crashes that would alert operators. Later versions are too cautious, failing to cause sufficient damage. The team studies failure modes of IR-1 centrifuges, understanding that these machines, based on decades-old Pakistani designs derived from European models, have specific vulnerabilities related to rotational frequency and vibration resonance. The narrator observes that in these rooms the violence is still theoretical, bound in diagrams and flowcharts. The first line of code that touches a real centrifuge is still months away. But already the operation has crossed a threshold, not just gathering intelligence or conducting surveillance, but preparing to reach inside another nation's critical infrastructure and break it from within. The ethical debates continue in parallel. Some officials question whether this sets a dangerous precedent. Others argue the alternative is conventional military action with far greater consequences. By 2008, according to Sanger and subsequent analyses, the United States built a test bed replicating parts of Natanz's cascade at a national laboratory, allowing Olympic Games developers to trial malicious logic on real centrifuge hardware. The location remains undisclosed, likely Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee or another Department of Energy facility with experience in nuclear technology and secure spaces for sensitive experiments. The testbed uses actual IR-1 centrifuges, either obtained through intelligence channels from Pakistani or other sources, or reconstructed from technical specifications configured to match the cascade architecture at Natanz as understood from IAEA reports and intelligence collection. On a clear day in July 2008 at this undisclosed U.S. site, a Siemens engineer visiting under a government contract runs a standard diagnostic while observers from NSA and the Department of Energy stand behind safety glass. The engineer does not know the full purpose of the test. He's been told it relates to infrastructure security research, protecting critical systems from potential attack. The partial truth is standard practice in compartmented operations. A lab notebook records a controlled overspeed test. IR-1 rotors briefly driven above matter 400 Hz, then slowed to a few hundred Hz. Frequencies later matched in the Stuxnet attack sequences documented by ISIS in their technical analysis of the worm's payload. The centrifuge whines, the pitch rising sharply as the rotor accelerates beyond its design envelope. Vibration increases, measurable on instruments, but also perceptible through the floor. The observers watch data streams on multiple monitors: motor current, vibration amplitude, temperature readings from bearings, vacuum pressure. Within minutes, the centrifuge shows signs of mechanical stress, increased vibration, slight wobble visible through the observation window, temperature rising in critical components. The test is halted before catastrophic failure, but the data is clear. Sustained operation at these frequencies will cause damage. The motif returns. Someone adjusts a ceramic mug on the console so it doesn't vibrate off the edge as the test centrifuge winds higher. The gesture is automatic, protective of small objects in an environment designed to withstand larger forces. The sound is unsettling, a machine pushed beyond its design parameters, creating harmonics that set teeth on edge. Outside, the building looks like any other research facility, unmarked, surrounded by fencing, guarded but not obviously military. A parking lot holds ordinary sedans, a break room has a coffee maker and a bulletin board with safety reminders. Inside, engineers are proving that malicious code can make steel fail in silence, while the operator screen loops healthy readings captured moments before the attack began. The tests are repeated with variations, different frequency ranges, different duration of attacks, different intervals between cycles. Some tests examine the effect of repeatedly cycling between normal and abnormal speeds, a pattern designed to cause metal fatigue without immediate failure. Other tests explore whether slowing centrifuges dramatically causes different damage than accelerating them. Each test generates data: how long before rotors show fatigue, how much stress before catastrophic failure, whether the damage can be disguised as normal wear. High-speed cameras capture the physical response of rotors under stress, showing microscopic deformations that will, over time, lead to failure. The results are promising from an operational perspective. Centrifuges are delicate machines operating at extreme speeds in vacuum conditions where the margin for error is minimal. Small deviations in frequency can cause resonance, vibration, and eventual failure. And if the control system reports everything as normal, operators have no reason to intervene until it's too late. The key insight is that damage accumulates over time. A single attack cycle might cause minimal harm, but repeated cycles over weeks or months will degrade components to the point of failure. Engineers also test the data manipulation component. Can they record normal sensor data and play it back convincingly while the attack proceeds? Early attempts are crude, easily detectable by close inspection. Later versions are refined, capturing not just static values, but realistic variations, slight fluctuations in RPM, minor temperature changes, the kind of noise that real sensors produce. The goal is to make the false data indistinguishable from genuine readings unless someone physically inspects the centrifuges. The narrator notes that the test log calls this a proof of concept, language that sanitizes the intent. In Iran, the same pattern will later be listed as equipment failure, different words for the same physical reality. The gap between those two descriptions, one technical, one euphemistic, is where the Olympic Games live. The operation is designed to exploit the fact that complex systems break down, and when they do, the first assumption is rarely sabotage. Human operators trust their instruments. When instruments lie convincingly, humans make wrong decisions. We return to Natanz in early 2009. IAEA cameras watch rows of IR-1 machines spinning under desert soil, while inspectors read monthly summaries showing nearly 9,000 centrifuges installed at the fuel enrichment plant, with a growing number feeding uranium hexafluoride through cascades arranged in long parallel lines. The facility operates around the clock in shifts, staffed by technicians from the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran who monitor pressures, temperatures, and rotational speeds from control rooms that feel more like industrial plants than military installations. The work is repetitive, methodical, requiring constant attention, but rarely dramatic. In a small control room, a supervisor from the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, his name absent from public records, but his role visible in IAEA footage later described by journalists, checks printouts with operating frequencies clustered around 7 Hz, a compromise between optimal output and mechanical survivability. The IR-1 is an older design based on Pakistani centrifuges derived from European models from the 1970s, prone to vibration and requiring careful management. Each centrifuge is essentially a rapidly spinning tube in a vacuum, separating uranium isotopes through centrifugal force. Operating frequencies must be precise. Too slow and enrichment is inefficient, too fast and mechanical stress increases exponentially. The supervisor has worked at Natanz since the facility became operational in 2006, knows the sound of healthy cascades, can tell from subtle shifts in vibration when something needs adjustment. He walks through the underground halls occasionally, listening to the collective hum of thousands of centrifuges, a sound like wind through a narrow canyon. In his office, banks of monitors display data from sensors throughout the facility, cascade by cascade, row by row, individual machines when detail is needed. Temperature, pressure, flow rate, rotational speed, all tracked, logged, analyzed for trends that might indicate problems before they become failures. A context bridge situated the hall within the larger standoff. Tehran insists its program is peaceful, designed to produce fuel for nuclear power reactors and research. Iranian officials cite the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty's guarantee of the right to peaceful nuclear technology. Washington and Jerusalem view the growing stockpile of low-enriched uranium as the foundation for a future breakout, the moment when Iran could, if it chose, enrich to weapons-grade levels of 90% or higher and build a bomb within months. Non-proliferation experts at ICES and other institutes publish public reports on Natanz's throughput, drawing on the same IAEA annexes the Covert study in their lab, calculating how long it would take Iran to produce enough highly enriched uranium for one device, then several. The calculations depend on assumptions about Iran's intent and capabilities. Low-enriched uranium at 3.5% can fuel a reactor. Enriched to 20%, it becomes more useful for research reactors and medical isotopes, but also easier to further enrich to weapons grade. Each step up the enrichment ladder is faster than the last. The breakout timeline, how long from decision to functional weapon, becomes a critical metric in policy debates, with estimates ranging from months to over a year depending on assumptions. The supervisor does not think in those terms. His job is to keep the cascades running smoothly, to meet production targets set by officials he rarely sees, to minimize downtime and maximize efficiency. He reviews maintenance logs each morning, notes which centrifuges have been replaced during the night shift, schedules inspections for machines showing abnormal vibration patterns. The work is routine, repetitive, occasionally interrupted by equipment failures that are normal in any industrial operation. Centrifuges break. It's expected. The machines are spinning at supersonic speeds in near vacuum. Even small imperfections in manufacturing can lead to failure. Rotors must be perfectly balanced, bearings must be flawless, seals must maintain vacuum against constant stress. He has colleagues, other supervisors, engineers who specialize in specific systems, technicians who handle physical maintenance when machines need replacement. Some have worked in the nuclear sector for decades, others are younger, trained at Iranian universities in mechanical engineering and physics. The atmosphere is professional, focused on technical problems rather than politics. These are scientists and engineers doing what they were trained to do, building Iran's nuclear capability in accordance with what Tehran says is its legal right. The narrator notes that in the official IAEA language, the centrifuges have no inner life. They are numbers, cascades, and feed rates, abstract quantities and quarterly reports. The people who tend them will only enter the story when things start to go wrong. But they are there now, in the background, adjusting valves and reading gauges, monitoring trends, and troubleshooting problems, unaware that somewhere thousands of kilometers away, code is being written with their machines in mind, designed to turn routine into crisis without anyone understanding why. According to later reporting by The Washington Post, New York Times, and investigative work in Europe, the first operational variants of Stuxnet were deployed in 2009. Designed to cross an air-gapped network by hitching rides on USB flash drives and laptops used by contractors servicing Natanz. The air gap is supposed to be absolute, no connection between Natanz's industrial control systems and the outside internet, no way for external malware to reach the sensitive controls. But air gaps are bridged by human behavior. Technicians who use the same laptop at home and at work, contractors who transfer project files via USB drives, engineers who update software using removable media carried from corporate networks into secure facilities. On a weekday in June 2009, at a control system integrator's office in Isfahan, a technician plugs a Step 7 project file into a Windows machine. Isfahan, Iran's third-largest city, hosts numerous companies that support the nuclear program, providing engineering services, system integration, and technical support. The technician is an employee of one such company, contracted to provide updates and maintenance for Siemens control systems at various facilities. The action is routine. He does this dozens of times per week, moving project files between development systems and operational networks, carrying updates on USB drives because direct network connections don't exist or aren't trusted. Unseen, the worm's first module checks for Siemens software, specifically Step 7 engineering tools used to program PLCs. If it finds them, it checks for specific configurations of S7-300 and S7-400 PLCs connected to frequency converters of particular models, the exact combination used at Natanz. If the environment doesn't match, the worm goes dormant, hiding in the system but not activating, waiting patiently for the right conditions. If it does match, it begins mapping the network, identifying targets, cataloging the system architecture, preparing to execute its payload when conditions are optimal. The archival anchors are Symantec's extensive W32 and Stuxnet dossier, published in February 2011, and security research by Ralph Langner, a German industrial control systems expert who is among the first to analyze the worm's targeting logic in detail. Langner's forensic work, published on his blog and in technical papers, reconstructed how the worm spread from corporate networks into Natanz's inner control systems, exploiting vulnerabilities in Windows and using stolen digital certificates to appear legitimate to security software. The certificates were taken from Realtek Semiconductor and J-Micron Technology, Taiwanese companies whose digital signatures were used to make Stuxnet's drivers appear trustworthy. The worm is patient and discriminating. It spreads slowly, copying itself to new machines whenever USB drives are inserted, propagating through network shares where they exist, using multiple infection vectors to maximize coverage while minimizing detection. Most infections lead nowhere. The worm finds itself on a computer in India or Indonesia, recognizes the environment doesn't match its target profile, and remains dormant, invisible to casual observation. But eventually, inevitably, it finds its way onto machines that connect, however indirectly, to Natanz. From there, it propagates across the facility's internal network, searching for the S7315 and S7417 PLCs that control the centrifuge frequency converters. The search is methodical, automated, requiring no human guidance once the worm is inside. It maps the network topology, identifies control systems, and positions itself to intercept communications between operator workstations and the PLCs that regulate centrifuge speed. The infiltration takes weeks, the worm spreading through the facility systems without triggering alarms or attracting attention. Intelligence agencies monitoring Iranian networks detect anomalous activity, but cannot determine its exact nature or purpose. From outside, the worm's behavior appears as random network traffic, brief connections, and routine operations. Only those who designed it know what to look for, what patterns indicate successful infiltration versus dormant infection. The narrator notes that the operation's most dangerous moment looks in real time, like an engineer checking email on his lunch break, like a technician updating software between phone calls, like a contractor transferring files between offices while thinking about dinner. From this point on, every ordinary plugin is a potential breach point. The worm is inside Iran's nuclear infrastructure, spreading through networks that were supposed to be isolated, waiting for the command to activate. The air gap, Iran's primary defense against cyber intrusion, has been rendered meaningless by the simple human practice of carrying data between systems on portable media. By late November 2009, subtle anomalies began to appear in Natanz's performance. An ISIS report later concludes that roughly 1,000 centrifuges are quietly taken out of operation between November 2009 and late January 2010, even as installed capacity remains high on paper. The numbers don't add up. Cascades are listed as operational in daily reports, but output is declining. Enrichment rates are below projections. Maintenance logs show more frequent replacements than normal, machines being swapped out after shorter operational lifetimes than expected. Engineers begin to suspect quality control problems with centrifuge components, or perhaps issues with the uranium hexafluoride feed contamination that might be causing accelerated wear. In one shift in December 2009, a senior Iranian engineer frowned at vibration readings from a cascade in Hall A. The underground halls are designated by letter, each containing hundreds of centrifuges arranged in parallel cascades. The numbers are within tolerance, barely, but a faint shudder can be felt through the floor when you stand in certain places, a vibration that doesn't match the steady hum of normal operation. He mentions it to a colleague, who checks the data logs and sees nothing unusual. The control system reports stable frequencies, normal pressures, and healthy operation across all monitored parameters. The vibration, they conclude, must be something else. Resonance from nearby equipment, perhaps, or a minor imbalance that will correct itself through normal maintenance cycles. Stuxnet's payload has been activated. For 15 minutes at a time, infected centrifuges spin at roughly 1,410 Hz before dropping back to the normal 1.7 Hz. Then, weeks later, slow to around 850 Hz or lower for nearly an hour. Stress cycles designed to fatigue rotors while replaying a recording of stable operation to the operator's screen. The attack is intermittent, unpredictable, difficult to diagnose. When technicians physically inspect affected centrifuges during scheduled maintenance, they find signs of mechanical stress, rotors with microscopic cracks, bearings showing uneven wear, components that appear to have experienced forces beyond normal operating conditions. But the data logs show nothing wrong, no excursions outside normal parameters, no events that would explain the physical damage. An IAEA Safeguards report, dated 18th of February 2010, notes the sudden dismantling and replacement of hundreds of centrifuges, captured on surveillance cameras but unexplained in Iran's official correspondence with the agency. The inspectors noticed the unusual activity during their regular visits, more centrifuges being removed and replaced than normal maintenance would require, accelerated replacement schedules, cascades taken offline for longer than typical. They noted in their reports, but have no mandate to investigate the cause. Their job is to verify that nuclear material is not being diverted toward weapons, not to diagnose equipment failures or investigate industrial problems. Iranian engineers begin intensive troubleshooting. They examine centrifuge components for manufacturing defects, testing materials for weakness or contamination. They review uranium hexafluoride purity, checking for chemical contamination that might corrode internal components. They analyze maintenance procedures, looking for human error or procedural problems. Teams are formed to investigate specific failure modes, tasked with determining why so many machines are failing prematurely. Some suspect sabotage. Iran is under international pressure, subject to sanctions, and has experienced covert operations before. But suspecting sabotage and proving it are different things. They check for physical tampering, unauthorized access, modified components, signs that someone has been inside secure areas. They find nothing. The control systems show no signs of intrusion when examined with available tools. No unusual files, no modified software, no evidence that anyone has tampered with the programming. Every diagnostic tool they have says the systems are functioning correctly. Only the physical evidence, broken rotors, damaged bearings, cascades that need replacement, suggests something is wrong. The disconnect between digital normalcy and physical failure is baffling. Some engineers propose that the problem is endemic to the IR-1 design, that the machines are simply unreliable at the scale Iran is operating. Others argue that procurement problems, difficulty obtaining high-quality components due to sanctions, mean they're working with substandard materials. Still others insist something more sinister is happening, though they cannot prove it. The narrator points out that in Natanz's internal logs, the cause is recorded as mechanical failure, a category that covers everything from manufacturing defects to operator error. In the development rooms that wrote the code, the same pattern is logged as successful run, evidence that the worm is functioning as designed. The two descriptions exist in parallel universes, neither side fully understanding what the other sees, each interpreting the same events through completely different frameworks. Through early 2010, forensic analyses and later reconstructions show Stuxnet executing its full attack routine. It captures a slice of normal sensor data from the centrifuges, stores it in memory, then plays it back in an endless loop while quietly altering commands to the centrifuge drives. The technique is called a man-in-the-middle attack in cybersecurity parlance, but here it's applied not to intercept communications between two parties, but to create a false reality for human operators. Operators see recorded data from before the attack began. The centrifuges receive destructive commands that bear no relation to what the screens display. In January 2010, in the Natanz control room, a younger technician adjusts the position of his T-glass on the console as he watches a trend line show perfect stability. He's been on shift for 6 hours, monitoring the same screens, watching the same data streams, seeing the same reassuring patterns. The graph is smooth, reassuring, exactly what it should be. Frequencies holding steady, no alarms, no warnings, just the gentle noise of normal industrial operation represented in digital form. Down the hall, through reinforced doors and into the cascade halls themselves, physical machines are beginning to degrade, rotors developing microfractures that will eventually cause catastrophic failure, bearings wearing unevenly under abnormal stress, vacuum seals stressed by vibration that shouldn't exist. The worm's rootkit hides its processes from Windows Task Manager, making itself invisible to standard administrative tools. Event logs show nothing unusual when reviewed. No suspicious file operations, no unauthorized access, no software installations. The Siemens project files look intact when examined, their checksums matching expected values, their code appearing exactly as it should. Only deep forensic analysis by experts who know what to look for would reveal the modifications, and no one is looking because nothing appears wrong. In Fort Meade, monitoring teams receive intermittent telemetry from test networks in Iran. Systems deliberately left vulnerable to provide intelligence about Iranian cyber defenses, and in this case, feedback about Olympic Games. The specifics of how this intelligence is gathered remain classified, but according to secondary accounts of Sanger's sources, officials see evidence that the code is working. Natanz is replacing centrifuges at an abnormal rate. Enrichment output is below projections, suggesting the attack is having its intended effect. But they cannot see individual machines failing, cannot hear the vibrations or watch rotors degrade in real time. They have statistics and trends, aggregated data that suggests success without providing detail. Intelligence creates a strategic problem. How much damage is enough? If too many centrifuges fail too quickly, Iran might realize this is sabotage rather than industrial misfortune and take corrective action, shutting down all systems, replacing all software, fundamentally changing their security posture in ways that would end the operation. If too few fail, the operation achieves nothing, wastes years of development effort and significant risk. The code is calibrated to walk a line between effectiveness and detectability, to degrade Iran's program without triggering a response that would shut down the operation entirely. Back in Natanz, frustration grows among the engineering staff. They know something is wrong, but cannot identify the source. The pattern doesn't make sense. Failures are distributed across different cascades, different halls, different installation batches, suggesting the problem isn't tied to a specific manufacturing lot or operational period. They replace components systematically, implement new quality control measures, adjust operating parameters to reduce stress. Some measures help marginally, others have no effect. The problem persists. Some engineers begin to suspect sabotage openly, discussing it in meetings, proposing that components might have been sabotaged during procurement or the control systems might be compromised. But without evidence, these suggestions lead nowhere. Security teams investigate supply chains, interrogate contractors, review access logs. They find nothing concrete, no smoking gun, just a persistent pattern of failures that shouldn't be happening at this rate. The narrator remarks that the gap between what the screen shows and what the steel feels is exactly where the Olympic Games were designed to live. The operation exploits fundamental trust in automation, the assumption that if the computer says everything is fine, everything must be fine. Modern industrial systems are too complex for human operators to monitor directly. We rely on sensors and software to tell us what's happening inside sealed vessels, spinning at speeds that human perception cannot directly assess. When those systems lie convincingly, humans make wrong decisions, acting on false information while real damage accumulates invisibly. The next variable is not the code itself, which is functioning exactly as designed, but the people managing it and how long they can maintain secrecy once the worm escapes into the wild. On 17 June 2010, at the small security firm Virus Blockada in Minsk, Belarus, an analyst investigated a customer's complaint about frequent system reboots. The customer is in Iran, experiencing unexplained crashes on industrial systems, and has requested help diagnosing the problem. The analyst Sergei Ulisen begins routine diagnostics, checking for common malware, reviewing system logs, examining running processes. He finds something unexpected, an unfamiliar rootkit he initially logs as Rootkit Temfider, soon to be renamed Stuxnet by Symantec when they begin their own analysis and the name enters common usage in the security community. The scene is mundane. An office on the second floor of a modest building, a window cracked open to summer air, letting in sounds of traffic and conversation from the street below. The low hum of desktop computers fills the room, mixed with the occasional click of keyboards and quiet discussions between colleagues. A monitor filled with hexadecimal code scrolls past as the analyst digs deeper into the malware's structure, using debugging tools and disassemblers to understand what he's found. Someone moves a coffee mug away from the keyboard to free desk space for a printout of memory dumps, the paper covered with strings of characters that represent the malware's code. The analyst notes an exploit using a zero-day vulnerability in Windows, a security flaw in how Windows handles shortcut files, allowing malware to execute simply by being viewed in Explorer. It's a clever trick, one that shouldn't exist if Microsoft's security testing were perfect. But software is written by humans, and humans make mistakes, leaving gaps that sophisticated attackers can exploit. Stuxnet will ultimately be found to contain at least 4 0 days, an unprecedented number that suggests significant resources behind its development, far beyond typical cybercrime operations. The discovery begins quietly, a footnote in a small firm's case log, one of dozens of malware samples analyzed each week. But as Virus Blockada shares samples with other security researchers through industry networks, the scale of what they've found becomes clear. The malware is massive by 2010 standards, over 500 kilobytes, enormous compared to typical viruses that measure in tens of kilobytes. It contains multiple modules, each handling different functions: spreading, hiding, reconnaissance, and a mysterious payload that initially makes no sense. Analysis reveals sophisticated anti-detection mechanisms, the rootkit that hides the malware's files, registry modifications that ensure persistence across reboots, and encryption that obscures the code's true purpose. By 15th of July 2010, journalist Brian Krebs published the first widely read blog post about the worm on his site, Krebs on Security, titling it, "Microsoft Patches Serious Zero-Day Flaw." Within days, major security companies including Symantec, Kaspersky, and F-Secure are examining samples, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Industrial Control Systems Cyber Emergency Response Team issues an advisory warning about malware targeting Siemens systems. The security community is stunned as analysis progresses. The level of sophistication suggests a nation-state actor with significant resources, not just money, but access to zero-day exploits that typically cost hundreds of thousands of dollars on underground markets, stolen digital certificates from legitimate companies, and detailed knowledge of industrial control systems. The targeting of Siemens PLCs specifically suggests a strategic objective beyond typical cybercrime or espionage, which usually focuses on stealing data or money rather than damaging physical equipment. Researchers begin reverse engineering the code systematically, documenting its structure, publishing analyses that piece together its functionality. Ralph Langner, analyzing the PLC code with his background in industrial automation, recognizes that it's designed to attack centrifuges, specifically the configuration used for uranium enrichment. The frequencies, the timing sequences, the specific PLCs targeted, everything points to Natanz. He published his findings on his blog in September 2010, and suddenly, what was a technical curiosity became a geopolitical story covered by mainstream media worldwide. The analysis spreads through academic networks, security conferences, and intelligence agencies. Within months, Stuxnet became the most analyzed piece of malware in history, dissected in papers and presentations, its techniques cataloged and studied by thousands of researchers trying to understand both its capabilities and its implications. The narrator notes that the operation is still ongoing in Natanz. Later variants of Stuxnet remain active, continuing to cause damage even as security researchers worldwide examine earlier versions. But from this day forward, the Olympic Games are no longer a secret tactic. It is a case study, analyzed in academic papers and security conferences, its code dissected and documented in exhaustive detail. The weapon meant to stay inside one facility has stepped into the open internet, where anyone with sufficient expertise can study its techniques and potentially replicate them for their own purposes. In July 2010, according to Sanger's New York Times investigation and later scholarly analysis, President Barack Obama met with cyber and national security advisors to consider whether the Olympic Games should be halted now that Stuxnet has been discovered in the wild. The meeting takes place in a secure conference room, the participants understanding that they're discussing not just one operation, but the future of cyber warfare itself. The decision is not obvious or straightforward. Continuing risks further exposure, potential diplomatic fallout as more evidence emerges, linking the worm to the United States, and setting a precedent that other nations might follow with less discriminate attacks. Stopping means abandoning an operation that appears to be working, allowing Iran time to recover and patch vulnerabilities, and possibly losing the option to resume later once Iran hardens its systems. In a secure conference room in the White House, aides spread printouts of Symantec's preliminary analysis beside classified slides showing recent IR-1 failures at Natanz and intelligence assessments of Iran's response. The technical team argues that newer, more stealthy variants are still inside the facility and remain effective. The versions being analyzed publicly are earlier iterations, while improved versions continue to operate. Intelligence officials warn that stopping now might allow Iran to patch systems completely and recover quickly, potentially accelerating their program if they interpret the attack as evidence they're close to a breakout. The room is cool, air-conditioned against Washington's humid summer, with the quiet hum of electronics and the occasional shuffle of paper as participants review briefing materials. Academic summaries of this meeting, drawing on Sanger's reporting in Confront and Conceal and subsequent interviews with officials who spoke on condition of anonymity, quote the essential argument. Obama decides to continue the operation, despite the risk that more code could leak and be attributed to the United States, judging that the delay imposed on Iran's enrichment program is worth the potential precedent of legitimizing cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. The calculation is cold. Iran is estimated to be somewhere between 1 and 3 years from having enough enriched uranium for a weapon, and even a few additional months of delay justifies significant strategic risk. The meeting also addresses legal and ethical questions that have been debated within the administration since Obama inherited the program from Bush. Some officials worry that attacking civilian infrastructure, even with the goal of preventing nuclear weapons development, crosses lines that will be difficult to redraw. Iran's nuclear program is controversial and possibly illegal under international norms, but it's not an active armed conflict. Does that matter legally? Can a cyber attack be justified as self-defense against a future threat? What frameworks of international law apply to operations that cause physical damage but don't kill people? Others argue that the alternative is worse in concrete terms. Either accept a nuclear Iran with all the regional destabilization that implies, or launch military strikes that would kill people and potentially trigger a broader regional war. Cyber sabotage occupies an ambiguous middle ground, destructive but not violent, covert but increasingly exposed, effective in the short term but with uncertain long-term consequences. The debate reflects genuine uncertainty about how to categorize actions that don't fit neatly into existing legal or ethical frameworks. Obama's decision allows the Olympic Games to continue into 2011, though with modifications designed to reduce the risk of further exposure. New variants are deployed that are more targeted, less likely to spread beyond intended systems, with better controls to prevent global propagation. The operation gradually winds down over the following year, eventually ending not with a formal termination order, but with diminishing returns as Iran replaces compromised systems and implements better security measures. By late 2011, most observers believed the operation had run its course. The narrator points out that this is a rare moment where a head of state personally adjusts the dial between technical success and strategic risk, making a decision that will be studied by historians and ethicists for decades. From here on, every damaged rotor in Natanz will be matched by a growing unease in policymaking circles about what has just been unleashed. Not just the specific worm that attacked Iranian centrifuges, but the concept that critical infrastructure anywhere can be targeted by code written in distant secure rooms, that the boundary between espionage and attack has become blurry, that actions in cyberspace can have consequences in the physical world. The decision to continue the Olympic Games despite exposure is, in retrospect, the moment when cyber warfare moved from theoretical possibility to accepted reality. Through late 2010, Stuxnet variants spread beyond Iran, infecting Windows systems in countries with no connection to Natanz. Security firms report tens of thousands of detections worldwide, though most installations never activate the centrifuge sabotage payload because the infected systems lack the specific Siemens PLCs and frequency converters the worm is designed to target. India shows high infection rates, likely due to widespread use of pirated Windows software and Siemens equipment in manufacturing. Indonesia, Pakistan, Azerbaijan all show significant numbers of infections, creating a global pattern that obscures the worm's true target, even as security researchers focus on understanding its purpose. In an operations room at Symantec's offices in Culver City, Southern California, one evening in September 2010, analysts map infections on a world display that covers one wall, each detection appearing as a point of light on a digital map. The visualization shows hotspots in Asia and the Middle East, with scattered infections across Europe and North America. They trace digital signatures back to a common code base, identifying different versions of the worm with subtle variations. Version 0.5, 1.0, 1.1, each iteration adding features or fixing bugs in previous releases, suggesting active development over years. Their internal W32 Stuxnet dossier, which will be published publicly in February 2011, documents the worm's architecture in exhaustive detail across more than 60 pages. Modular structure, allowing different components to be updated independently without rewriting the entire codebase, stolen digital certificates from legitimate Taiwanese companies, Realtek and J-Micron, used to make the malware appear trustworthy to Windows security. Multiple zero-day exploits, including vulnerabilities in Windows Print Spooler and Task Scheduler that allow the worm to spread and elevate privileges, and highly specialized industrial control routines that serve no purpose except to manipulate centrifuge operations in very specific ways. The dossier becomes required reading in cybersecurity circles, distributed at conferences, and cited in hundreds of subsequent papers. It reveals techniques that are quickly adopted by other actors, both nation-states developing their own cyber weapons and criminal groups seeking to exploit the same vulnerabilities. The use of stolen certificates becomes common in advanced malware. Techniques for targeting industrial control systems proliferate. The concept of crossing air gaps via USB drives spreads. Security researchers describe Stuxnet as a watershed, the moment when cyber warfare moved from theory to demonstrated capability, from classified speculation to public knowledge. At the same time, industry papers and IEE articles, particularly Ralph Langner's detailed technical analysis titled The Real Story of Stuxnet, begin to describe it as the first cyber weapon to cause physical damage to critical infrastructure. The distinction matters. Previous malware had stolen information through espionage, disrupted services through denial of service attacks, or caused economic damage through ransomware. But Stuxnet physically destroyed equipment in the real world. Machines that cost tens of thousands of dollars each were rendered useless, requiring replacement and causing delays measured in months. The psychological impact within the security community is significant. Suddenly, the theoretical threat of cyber-physical attacks is concrete, demonstrated, proven feasible. Some researchers express concern that publishing detailed analyses of Stuxnet's techniques provides a blueprint for future attacks. The transparency in this case does more harm than good. Why teach potential attackers exactly how to cross air gaps, manipulate PLCs, and hide malicious code? Others argue that transparency is essential for defense, that only by understanding how the attack worked can organizations protect themselves, that security through obscurity has never worked, that the details will eventually emerge regardless. The debate reflects a broader tension in cybersecurity between disclosure and operational security, between the public good of informed defense and the risk of enabling new attacks. The security industry responds with new tools, better detection of rootkits, monitoring for PLC code modifications, network segmentation to isolate critical systems, policies restricting USB drive usage in sensitive environments. But the fundamental problem remains. Industrial control systems were never designed with security in mind, built in an era when air gaps seemed sufficient protection, now facing threats from sophisticated actors who can bridge those gaps. The narrator notes that what had started as a tightly scoped operation against one facility in Iran is now teaching the broader world how to build similar tools. The code has done its job in Natanz. Its next impact will be in other people's hands, hackers studying its techniques for their own purposes, nation-states developing similar capabilities against different targets, security professionals racing to defend against attacks that follow Stuxnet's template. The genie is out of the bottle, and no one knows how to put it back. By early 2011, open-source assessments from ISIS, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and the World Nuclear Association converge on a rough picture. Iran removed and replaced roughly 900 to 1,000 IR-1 centrifuges at Natanz between late 2009 and early 2010, almost certainly due to Stuxnet's interference. The timing correlates precisely with the worm's known deployment window and the documented activation of its destructive payload. No other explanation fits the pattern. Neither quality control problems nor routine maintenance would produce such a sudden spike in replacements, concentrated in a specific time window, followed by a return to more normal replacement rates. In a modest office in Washington, D.C., non-proliferation analyst David Albright reviews successive IAEA reports under fluorescent light, marking in red the months where Natanz's installed capacity drops while feed and withdrawal numbers stay relatively flat. He works for the Institute for Science and International Security, a think tank focused on nuclear proliferation issues, with access to public IAEA documents and extensive networks of sources who provide context. His December 2010 paper, "Did Stuxnet Take Out Thousand Centrifuges at the Natanz Enrichment Plant?" became a key public reference for understanding the attack's physical impact, cited by journalists and policymakers trying to assess what actually happened. Albright's analysis is careful, methodical, based on IAEA data and reasonable inferences rather than classified intelligence. He notes that IAEA reports show approximately 8,700 centrifuges operating at Natanz in November 2009, but by February 2010, only around 3,900 are actively enriching uranium, even though the total installed capacity remains high. The gap suggests that roughly 4,800 centrifuges are installed but not operating, some undergoing maintenance, others presumably damaged and awaiting replacement. When he cross-references this with reports of centrifuge removals captured on IAEA cameras, the picture emerges. Somewhere between 900 and 1,000 machines were taken out of service during this period, a replacement rate far exceeding normal expectations. Context bridge, U.S. officials quoted in NTI analyses and later media reports estimate that the Olympic Games delayed Iran's nuclear program by somewhere between 18 months and 2 years, a significant achievement for a covert operation, but not a permanent solution by any means. Iran quickly adapted, replacing damaged machines with new units, implementing better security measures for their control systems, and continuing enrichment. By 2012, Iran's stockpile of low-enriched uranium had actually grown beyond pre-Stuxnet levels, though it might have grown faster without the attack. The delay bought time for diplomacy, but did not fundamentally alter Iran's trajectory toward nuclear capability. The human cost, largely invisible in these technical assessments, includes Iranian engineers who spent months troubleshooting phantom problems, running diagnostics that revealed nothing, implementing fixes that didn't work. Technicians faced pressure from superiors to explain failures they couldn't understand, to improve performance when they didn't know what was causing degradation. Security officials conducted internal investigations looking for saboteurs who never physically entered the facility, interrogating contractors and employees, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia. Some engineers left the nuclear program entirely, frustrated by equipment problems they couldn't solve or demoralized by the realization that their facility had been penetrated. Others doubled down, determined to overcome what they eventually understood as foreign sabotage. For the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, Stuxnet represented both a technical defeat and a learning opportunity. Iran improved its cybersecurity significantly after the attack, reducing reliance on foreign technology where possible, developing indigenous control systems, and implementing stricter protocols for software updates and network access. They compartmentalized systems more thoroughly, added monitoring for unusual PLC behavior, and trained personnel to recognize signs of cyber intrusion. In that sense, the Olympic Games achieved its immediate goal of delay, but also accelerated Iran's development of defensive capabilities that will make future attacks more difficult. The operation also had diplomatic implications when Stuxnet's nature became public. It complicated international negotiations over Iran's nuclear program, making it harder for Iranian moderates to argue for cooperation with the West. If Western nations were actively sabotaging Iran's facilities, why should Iran trust agreements about inspection and verification? The covert attack undermined overt diplomacy in ways that policymakers didn't fully anticipate. The narrator notes that in these assessments, the human cost is nearly invisible. The casualties are equipment and timelines, measured in broken centrifuges and lost months rather than injured or displaced people. The people who maintained the code and those who maintained the centrifuges rarely appear in the footnotes, their experiences reduced to operational data, their names omitted or classified, their stories untold except in fragments. By 2012 through 2014, Stuxnet became a reference point in debates over cyber warfare, featured prominently in the documentary 0 Days, directed by Alex Gibney and Kim Zetter's book Countdown to Zero Day, both of which reconstruct the operation's discovery and political context through extensive interviews. These works draw on sources in the U.S. and Israeli intelligence communities, who, while often speaking anonymously to protect their identities and ongoing operations, describe a professional community both proud of the technical achievement and deeply uneasy about its implications. The operation succeeded brilliantly in its immediate tactical goal, but it also opened doors that cannot be closed, established precedents that other nations will cite, and legitimized forms of warfare whose long-term consequences remain uncertain. Academic works on cyber conflict, published in journals focused on international security and technology policy, repeatedly cite Sanger's 2012 New York Times article, Obama Order Sped Up, Wave of Cyber Attacks Against Iran, and subsequent scholarship as foundational texts for understanding the operation. These analyses note that the Olympic Games was the first sustained use of offensive cyber weapons by a state against critical infrastructure, a milestone in the evolution of warfare comparable to the first use of aircraft or submarines in combat. The precedent shapes international discussions about cyber norms, arms control, and the laws of armed conflict. If the United States and Israel can target Iran's nuclear facilities with malware, the argument goes, what stops Russia from targeting Ukrainian power grids, or China from attacking American water systems, or North Korea from sabotaging South Korean telecommunications? In military colleges and intelligence training centers worldwide, instructors pull up diagrams of Stuxnet when discussing SCADA systems, air-gapped networks, and the ethics of weapons that once released can be repurposed by others. The curriculum includes technical analysis of how the worm worked, strategic discussion of when such tools should be used, and ethical debates about proportionality and discrimination in cyber operations. The same techniques used to sabotage centrifuges could theoretically be adapted to target other industrial systems, chemical plants, water treatment facilities, electrical grids, transportation control systems. PowerPoint slides show the Natanz cascade layouts that once appeared only in classified annexes. The small coffee cup on the console is gone from these sanitized images, edited out or never photographed, but the cascade arrangement remains a standard model for understanding cyber-physical attacks. Some former officials defend the operation publicly when they can speak about it without violating classification rules. In interviews with journalists, memoirs published after retirement, and testimony before congressional committees, they argue that the Olympic Games achieved its purpose, delaying Iran's program by months or years, buying time for diplomacy to work, avoiding military strikes that would have killed people and potentially destabilized an already volatile region. They point to the eventual Iran nuclear deal negotiated in 2015 as evidence that the delay mattered. The time on the clock allowed space for negotiation that might not have existed otherwise. Without the Olympic Games, they argue, the choice might have been between accepting a nuclear Iran or launching airstrikes with unpredictable consequences. Others express regret, though often carefully and privately. In off-the-record conversations reported by journalists who protect their sources, former intelligence officials worry that Stuxnet normalized attacks on civilian infrastructure, that it provided diplomatic and moral cover for less discriminate operations by other nations with fewer scruples about collateral damage, that the long-term costs may outweigh the short-term gains. They note that Russia, China, North Korea, Iran itself, and other nations have developed sophisticated cyber capabilities, studying tools like Stuxnet and developing their own variants. The techniques are out there now, available to any nation-state with sufficient resources and technical expertise. The debate extends into academic circles, with ethicists and legal scholars writing about whether the Olympic Games was justified under existing frameworks of international law, whether it violated norms about attacking civilian infrastructure, whether the fact that it didn't kill anyone makes it more acceptable than conventional military action. The discussions are nuanced, technical, often inconclusive, but they establish that cyber weapons raise questions that previous frameworks don't adequately address. The narrator points out that the Olympic Games are now part of military doctrine, not just history. Future planners will see it as a template, a proof of concept, an example of what's possible rather than a cautionary tale, unless they pay attention to what happened next, the spread of techniques beyond their intended use, the normalization of infrastructure attacks, the erosion of barriers between cyber espionage and cyber warfare, the creation of a world where any complex system connected to a computer is potentially vulnerable to attack from sophisticated actors. The final chapter connects the earlier sabotage to later blows against the same facility. In April 2021, Iran reported a power failure and sabotage at Natanz that destroyed hundreds of centrifuges and set back enrichment operations by months, an incident widely attributed to Israel, though never officially confirmed. In June 2023, reports indicated another mysterious incident affecting Iranian nuclear facilities. Then, in June 2025, IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi and independent analysts report that an Israeli strike has severely damaged or destroyed operating centrifuges in one of Natanz's underground halls by cutting its power supply, a physical replay of Stuxnet's logic, using explosives and precision strikes instead of code to achieve the same fundamental end, making centrifuges destroy themselves through sudden loss of control. The context bridge is stark and deliberate. In both cyber and kinetic attacks, the method is to make centrifuges fail catastrophically, exploiting their fundamental vulnerability to rapid changes in operating conditions. The physics are similar, whether caused by corrupted control commands or sudden power loss. Machines spinning at extreme speeds cannot survive abrupt changes without suffering mechanical damage. Public Reuters and Wall Street Journal reports outline these recent attacks in the same dry technical language used years earlier for the malware. Damage, setback, delay, the vocabulary of disruption remaining constant even as the methods evolve from purely digital to hybrid cyber-physical to entirely kinetic. The pattern suggests a sustained campaign spanning more than 15 years, from the initial deployment of Stuxnet in 2009 through recent strikes in 2025, with multiple operations in between. Each attack sets back Iran's program temporarily, forcing replacement of damaged equipment and implementation of new security measures, but none has permanently ended Iran's nuclear ambitions. The country has grown more resilient, more sophisticated in defending its facilities, more determined to achieve nuclear capability despite international opposition. Meanwhile, in Israel and the United States, many of the individuals involved in the Olympic Games have moved on or retired from government service. Their names surface occasionally in books like Sanger's Confront and Conceal, documentaries like 0 Days, and congressional testimony about cyber operations when committees seek expertise on emerging threats. Some work for private security firms, applying lessons learned in classified programs to commercial cybersecurity. Others teach at universities, training the next generation of security professionals. A few remain in government service on different projects. They're Olympic Games experience now one operation among many in long careers. The technical details of Stuxnet remain preserved in PDFs on security researchers' websites and in academic archives, freely available to anyone with internet access and sufficient expertise to understand them. Snippets of its code are still used by malware analysts as training examples, teaching students how sophisticated attacks are constructed, what techniques nation-states employ, and how to recognize similar patterns in new malware. The knowledge has proliferated beyond any possibility of containment. For Iran, the legacy of Stuxnet and subsequent operations is not just damaged hardware, but a permanent suspicion that any malfunction might be sabotage, any system failure might be an attack from foreign intelligence services. This paranoia has real costs, resources devoted to security that could otherwise go to research or production, reluctance to adopt new technologies that might contain hidden vulnerabilities, difficulty trusting even air-gapped systems that once seemed secure, constant vigilance that takes energy and attention away from other priorities. Iranian engineers must now consider whether every software update, every new component, every maintenance procedure might be a vector for attack. For the operation's authors and the nations they served, the legacy is a world where other states feel licensed to pursue their own cyber campaigns against critical infrastructure, where the threshold for what's acceptable has shifted permanently. If the United States and Israel can do this, why can't Russia, China, North Korea, or any other nation with sufficient technical capability? The precedent has been set, the boundary crossed, the capability demonstrated. The narrator observes that the machines at Natanz have changed. Iran now uses more advanced IR-2M and IR-6 centrifuges, has implemented better security protocols, has learned painful lessons from each attack, but the fundamental vulnerability remains. Complex systems depend on control systems that can be manipulated, on power supplies that can be disrupted, on human operators who must trust their instruments. The idea that code or explosives or any sufficiently clever intervention can make these systems fail has not gone away. If anything, as infrastructure becomes more connected and automated, as industrial control systems proliferate and become more sophisticated, the potential attack surface grows larger. The film ends not in a control room or a lab, but in an emptied office somewhere in a secure compound, perhaps at Fort Meade, perhaps in the Negev, perhaps elsewhere entirely. The joint development room that once housed Olympic Games, where American and Israeli programmers worked side by side, writing the code that would make centrifuges fail. It is late afternoon, no date given, no location specified. Dust hangs in a pale beam of light from a high window, visible as distinct particles floating slowly in still air. The racks that once held servers are gone, leaving only mounting holes in the floor. The whiteboards have been wiped clean, showing only faint ghostly traces of diagrams and equations that were erased but not quite completely. On one abandoned desk, shoved against a wall, sits a single monitor, dark and silent, its screen reflecting the empty room. Beside it stands the small potted plant, last watered years ago, now brittle and colorless in its ceramic pot, its leaves curled and brown, a few having fallen to gather dust on the desk surface. The camera holds on the dry leaves for several seconds, long enough to become uncomfortable, forcing the viewer to contemplate the passage of time and the permanence of consequences. There is no voiceover offering interpretation, no caption explaining the significance, no date stamp anchoring the image to a specific moment, only the faint hum of air conditioning continuing to cycle air through an empty room, and the knowledge, carried from the previous 2 hours of documentary, that somewhere underground, other centrifuges are still spinning in other facilities, waiting for the next line of carefully crafted code or the next precisely placed explosive charge. The motif closes where it began, a small object on a desk, once tended by someone who cared enough to water it, now forgotten and dead, marking the passage from routine to consequence, from inhabited workspace to abandoned monument. The plant that once represented normalcy in a room dedicated to disruption is now itself disrupted, a victim of neglect in a space that has moved beyond its original purpose into history.